Welcome to AP European History with Dr. Brovkin. This is part 3 of a series of videos on the Battle of Stalingrad, which is the turning point of World War II. So just to remind you briefly what we've covered in the first 2 segments. It was the offensive of the German army from Kharkov, which is in Ukraine, middle of Ukraine, towards the Volga River, which is 800 kilometers. And that took most of 6 months to the summer, from the winter of after the Battle of Moscow to the summer of 42. They're advancing and advancing, and it takes a long time. So by summer they're close to Stalingrad, and the city itself they enter in August, at the very end of August, 27th, 28th of August. So then the actual battle begins, which lasts for 2 months, and this is described in the preceding video, which is street battles, house after house, fierce fighting, the most fiercest fighting in World War II, with catastrophic casualties on both sides. And now we're coming to the actual Battle of Stalingrad, meaning Russian offensive, which is called Operation Uranius, and that would be the final blow that would begin in November 1943. So the background is like this, to remind you, crucial situation, that the German army is concentrated in around Stalingrad in concentrated force with heavy fighting, and the numbers are about 250,000 German troops. Now, on their sides, which is very crucial, are the Hungarians and Romanians and Italians. So their job is really to protect the flanks of the German army facing Stalingrad and the Volga River. And then, as mentioned many times before, then there is a gap between the 2 big German armies. And the second big army, which is called Army A, is going to the south, which is to the Caucasus Mountains, with the objective of taking Baku and providing oil to the German army. So this is, again, one more time, a crucial mistake that would cost Hitler this battle. The gap is exactly what the Russians started looking at as a possibility of a counteroffensive. So during the 2 months of fierce fighting in the city, September and October, the Russian High Command, which is called Stavka, were planning a counteroffensive. And for the first time, they began to do pincer movements, which is exactly what the Germans were so good at in 1941 and in 1942. And so now they're concentrating large forces on the other side of the Volga River. And the idea is to cross the river, which is very, very difficult undertaking, in order to create this pincer movement surrounding the German army. The northern flank was easier to do because they shipped the troops secretly about 100 kilometers north of Stalingrad, and the Germans didn't know anything about it, didn't notice, didn't have intelligence to do this. The southern flank was crucial because it was the southern flank that would go into the gap between the Army A and the Army B, the Army of Stalingrad and the Army of the Caucasus. So for the success of the operations, the Soviets really had to do this movement in the south. What they were particularly lucky about is that the gap was guarded only by Romanians and Italians and Hungarians, and they were, of course, secondary to the fighting capability as opposed to the German troops. So the Operation Uranius, which is again commanded by Zhukov, the commander who did the Battle of Moscow, and General Vasilevsky, they begin the offensive on the 19th of November. They break through the lines, and very quickly they close the gap. Within a matter of 3 weeks, they surround the German army of Stalingrad. And this is where the most dramatic and most interesting things begin. On the 30th of November, the commander-in-chief of the German army, Paulus, asks the permission from Hitler to break out to fight it back. And it is still possible, theoretically it is still possible that they could break out. Hitler says no. Now, this is the same kind of stubborn refusal to admit to reality, exactly as he refused to regroup the troops on the approaches to Moscow, which allowed the Soviets to regroup and strike back and push them 150 kilometers back. Now the same situation happens. Paulus pleads with Hitler to allow a breakthrough. Hitler says, no, stay put and fight. Now, why is that? What is the rationale behind it? Is there any rationale at all behind it? Well, on one side, it is a stubborn refusal to let go of something that has been achieved with such enormous casualties. It would be very hard to justify it. Why did you have to push and fight for every house in Stalingrad if now you want to run back and regroup? So this is one reason. But the more important reason, and the one that does make sense, is that the army of the Caucasus is not surrounded, but it is trapped. It has to have time to go back, which is about 1,000 kilometers from their farthest point of extension. Because if you look at the geography, if the army of the Stalingrad retreats, then then the gap can be closed, and there's no way the army of the Caucasus could be withdrawn because of the Black Sea and the mountains and the narrow passage that still would allow them to do so. In other words, Hitler's rationale is let them fight so that there is time to withdraw the army of the Caucasus. Or, to put it another way, one army has to die so that the other army could be withdrawn, or else they will both be destroyed. So this is the rationale, and he orders him to fight the battle to the end. So this brings us to the next segment, or the next period in this battle, which is from December 16th, 1942 to February 15th, 1943. So this is the second time in December this time Manstein, who is the commander of the German army on the other side, which is on the Don and the not surrounded armies, he again pleads with Hitler to allow a breakthrough. And Hitler again says no. And then Hitler convenes a meeting in his retreat in the Alps, and he has chiefs of German aviation, Göring, and the chief of Minister of Supplies, Speer, and many others, and they discuss what to do. And Göring, who assures that there is enough aircraft to supply the surrounded army by air, and they could be fighting there without particular problem, which is, of course, was an exaggeration. The specialists calculated how much they could ship. I think it's something like 700,000 tons, but this was not enough to bring the food and supply and ammunition to 250,000 men. So this was a boastful, basically, claim that couldn't be fulfilled. So it is kind of amazing that it's a huge army, 260,000 men, and Hitler does not want to let them break out, which is absolutely amazing. He does still order Paulus not to surrender and fight to the last man. He promotes him to the rank of Field Marshal with the idea that the Field Marshals do not surrender. So at this point, January 1943, there's absolutely no hope by this point that they could break out or that the supplies would be working. They are running out of ammunition, they are running out of food. I mean, they're in a very desperate situation. And Rokossovsky, who is a Russian commander, gives them a very generous offer, which is kind of important to note that it did happen. The offer was that if they surrender, they would be provided by the Geneva Convention. They would be treated well as prisoners of war. They would be provided medical care to the wounded. They would be allowed to keep their uniforms. They would be guaranteed life and safety and honor. And after the war, they would be allowed to leave to any country they wanted to. So these were very, very generous offer, but Paulus again asked for permission to accept, and of course Hitler said no. And they didn't, but what the Russians then did, they started really heavy bombardment of the surrounded army, and this was a catastrophic casualties, and then they were broken up into smaller units, and then regiment by regiment, division by division did surrender. So as a result, there were close to 150,000, something like this. Nobody knows for sure. Prisoners of war, 22 generals and 1 field marshal. And they were all taken prisoners of war, but they were not treated with the same kind of conditions as Rokossovsky ordered. I mean, they were shipped to Siberia. Hitler did not even acknowledge that they exist. Many of them died in Siberian camps, and only some estimates 10,000, some estimates 30,000 did come back to Germany in 1956, 10 years after the war. So now briefly about the wrap-up operation, and then about the significance of the Battle of Stalingrad. The wrap-up operation is extraordinarily successful. It was really a rout of the German army. Just listen to this. The fighting actually stopped in February 43. In 18th of March, which is a month. The Russian armies covered the distance of 800 kilometers. They took Kharkov in mid-March, and then Rostov-on-Don on the 14th of March. So this was a distance that the Red Army covered in 3 weeks, which it took the Germans 6 months or 8 months to fight. Everything that they fought during the entire year of 1942 is relinquished. It's gone. They're back in Kharkov, which is where they were in 1941. So this is a total disaster for the German army. And now just sum up the significance of the Battle of Stalingrad, what it showed and the causes of it. Well, I have wound up in this kind of a list of causes. What are the causes of German defeat and the causes of Russian victory? Number one is, I would say, Hitler's blunders. And one could list those blunders one after another. The very first blunder was to separate the army of the Caucasus and the army of the Volga, and the gap that one army couldn't come to its aid. It was very ambitious, very risky, and in case of defeat, catastrophic plan. Because as a Russian proverb goes, if you try to catch 2 mice, you will not catch any, and that's what they tried to do. They tried to pursue 2 objectives, and then the result, they didn't get any objective. So Hitler's blunders, number one, is this diversion of the 2 armies. The blunder number 2, of course, is the refusal to regroup. Blunder number 3, refusal to break out of and the blunder number 4 is he thought he could supply them with air, which turned out to be impossible. So this is Hitler's blunders is number 1. Number 2, I think it's extremely important, is maybe it's also number 1, is heroism of Russian fighters. The kind of street-to-street, house-to-house fighting, the kind of resistance that was put up was never had seen in any battles anywhere before or after. This is absolutely extraordinary with which tenacity and heroism the Russian soldiers fought for every house in Stalingrad. Number 3 is the defense capacity of the Soviet Union, which was vastly underestimated by Hitler and his intelligence. Because as the video in the last time showed, the Soviets are beginning to produce more tanks. than the Germans, and they're producing more aircraft than the Germans, and the quality of their arms is not inferior, and in some cases is superior, and that is also in terms of aircraft and in terms of tanks, about equal, or one of them could be superior or the other. But then the Soviets have one new weapon that doesn't exist in the German army at all, which is multiple rocket missile launches, which is called Katyusha. This is a totally new type of weapon that hadn't ever been used before, and the Germans were nowhere close to producing or invented this. They did produce by 1944 a flying missile that would bomb a V-bomb that would bomb London, but that was 1944. That was still a year before they could do it. But the Russian army did begin to use Katyushas, or the multiple rocket missile launches, already in the Battle of Stalingrad. So technological gap is closing really fast, and in fact the Russians do have a superiority in the quality of weapons and the quantity of weapons. And number 4 is the tactics. The Russians have learned from their mistakes. They're beginning to do the pincer movements and the surrounding action just like the Germans used to in 1941. So they have more confidence, they have more soldiers. And number 5, they have more resources in terms of manpower. I mean, the Russian army is already 1 million men more than the German, and it's going to continue to rise in numbers. So the mobilizational machine of the Soviet Union is just getting into high gear and is going to be unstoppable. So basically, the Battle of Stalingrad is a turning point, and from now on it would be just German armies rolling back, and the only other time they're going to try to fight back would be the Battle of Kursk, which we will consider in the next video. Thank you very much. Subscribe, tell your friends. Thank you.